Richard Hale owned the building. He owned the company inside it, the trucks in the parking lot, the 700 jobs that depended on his signature. But on a grey Monday morning, he walked through his own front doors wearing a torn jacket, worn-out boots, and 3 days of stubble he hadn't bothered to shave. No one recognized him. Not the security guard who barely glanced up. Not the manager who looked him over and sighed before handing him a clipboard. Not a single person in the building where Richard Hale's name was on every paycheck. He had come to find out something he could no longer see from the top floor of his own company. What his employees were really like when they thought no one important was watching. He had no idea the truth would be far more painful than he expected, or that, by the end of the day, a stranger's quiet kindness would remind him of a debt he had spent 30 years forgetting he owed. Richard Hale was 58 years old, and by almost every measure he had won. He ran Hale Logistics, a company that had grown from a single rented truck into a distribution empire with warehouses across 4 states. His name appeared in business magazines, his signature approved raises, layoffs, and multi-million-dollar contracts. People stood a little straighter when he walked into a room. He hadn't set foot on a warehouse floor in almost 6 years. His days were built from boardrooms, quarterly reports, and calls with investors who cared about numbers on a spreadsheet far more than the hands that made those numbers possible. Richard told himself this was simply what success looked like. A man builds something. Eventually, he rises above the daily grind of it. That was the natural order of things. But lately, something had been gnawing at him, a quiet, uncomfortable feeling he couldn't quite name. It had started 3 weeks earlier, at his mother's house, while cleaning out a closet of his late father's old belongings. He found a small photograph tucked inside a cigar box. A much younger Richard, thin and tired, standing beside an older man in front of a rusted delivery truck, the very first truck Hale Logistics had ever owned. The man beside him was Walter Grant. Richard hadn't thought about that name in years. 30 years ago, Richard Hale had nothing. He was 28, freshly failed at 2 other business attempts, deep in debt, and 1 missed payment away from losing the small apartment he shared with his wife. No bank would lend him money. No investor would take a meeting. Except one man, Walter Grant, a retired freight company owner who had spent 40 years learning the delivery business from the ground up, literally, as a driver himself before he ever owned a single truck. Grant had met Richard at a diner counter, listened to his plan for 2 hours over black coffee, and then done something no one else had been willing to do. He wrote Richard a check for $11,000, everything Grant had left in savings. "I'm not investing in your business plan, son," Grant told him. "I'm investing in you. Just promise me one thing." "Anything," Richard said. "Don't forget where you came from, whatever this becomes, and I think it'll become something. Remember what it felt like to have nothing. That's the only thing that'll keep you decent once you have everything." Richard had meant it when he promised. He meant it for years, actually. But somewhere between the first 10 trucks and the first 100, between the first employee and the first 1,000, that promise had quietly slipped away from him, the way most promises do, not all at once, but one forgotten year at a time. Walter Grant passed away 11 years ago. Richard sent flowers. He didn't attend the funeral. He had a board meeting that couldn't be moved. He hadn't thought about that day in a long time, until he found the photograph. Richard couldn't shake the feeling the photograph left behind. He thought about his 700 employees, the drivers, the warehouse staff, the overnight loading crews, most of whom he had never spoken to, most of whom likely wouldn't recognize his face if he stood beside them in an elevator. He thought about the reports that crossed his desk each quarter. Turnover numbers, injury claims, complaints filed through HR that were quietly settled and closed. He had always assumed his managers handled these things fairly. He had never once checked. That night, Richard made a decision that surprised even himself. He would go to one of his own warehouses, not as the CEO, but as an ordinary man applying for a day labor position. No suit, no driver, no assistant trailing behind him with a tablet. Just Richard, dressed like a man with nothing, standing in line like everyone else. He told his wife he had a conference out of town. He told his assistant to clear his calendar for a personal matter. He didn't tell anyone the truth. He wanted to see, with his own eyes, what kind of company he had actually built. The Hale Logistics warehouse on Route 9 opened its hiring line at 6 in the morning. Richard arrived at 5:30, wearing an old jacket he found in the back of his closet, and a pair of boots scuffed enough to look like they'd walked 100 miles. He hadn't shaved. He hadn't slept well either. Nerves, mostly, though he couldn't say exactly what he was nervous about. By 6, nearly 30 people stood in line ahead of him for 8 open day labor positions. An older woman clutched a folder of documents against her chest, like it held everything she owned. A young man paced back and forth, mouthing what looked like a rehearsed introduction. 2 brothers stood together, silent, sharing a single cup of gas station coffee between them. Richard had walked past people like this his entire career, in photographs, in reports, in the abstract language of labor costs and headcount. He had never stood among them. It felt different than he expected. Smaller, colder, longer. When the warehouse doors finally opened, a man in a company polo, a shift supervisor named Doyle, stepped out with a clipboard and began calling names in a flat, impatient voice. Richard gave his middle name, Thomas, and the last name of his childhood street, Ellery. Thomas Ellery. No one questioned it. He was assigned to the loading dock. The work was harder than Richard remembered, and he had done manual labor before, decades ago, in the earliest days of the company. His back ached within the first hour. His hands blistered by the second. But it wasn't the labor that surprised him. It was Doyle. The supervisor moved through the warehouse like a man who enjoyed being feared. He mocked an older worker for moving too slowly, loud enough for the entire floor to hear. He threatened to send 2 people home without pay over a stacking mistake that wasn't even theirs. When a young worker asked, politely, for a 5-minute break to take medication, Doyle told him to wait until lunch or don't bother coming back tomorrow. Richard stood there, listening, saying nothing. This was his company, his name on the building, and he had never once heard how it sounded from the floor. Around midday, it was Richard's turn to feel it directly. A stack of boxes he had organized, following instructions given to him only minutes earlier, was suddenly deemed wrong by Doyle, who hadn't checked the instructions himself. "Are you slow, or just lazy?" Doyle snapped, loud enough for half the dock to hear. "Redo it. And if it's wrong again, don't bother clocking back in tomorrow." Richard felt something tighten in his chest. Not quite anger, something closer to shame. Shame that a man wearing his company's uniform spoke to people this way. Shame that it had likely been happening for years, quietly, beneath layers of management Richard had never bothered to look past. He said nothing. He redid the boxes. He needed to see how far this went. At lunch, Richard sat alone on an overturned crate near the loading dock, unsure whether his blistered hands could even hold the sandwich he'd brought. A young woman approached, wearing the same warehouse uniform, carrying a small lunch bag. She looked to be in her mid-20s, with tired eyes but a steady, unbothered presence, the kind of calm that seemed earned rather than natural. "You're new," she said, not really a question. "First day," Richard admitted. "Doyle giving you a hard time?" Richard hesitated. "A little." The young woman gave a small, knowing smile. "He does that to everyone new, especially the ones who don't push back. Don't take it personal. It's not about you." She sat down across from him without asking, opened her lunch bag, and pulled out half a sandwich, sliding it toward him. "You look like you didn't bring enough," she said simply. Richard glanced at his own half-eaten meal, then at her. "I have food," he said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. "That's kind of the point." She introduced herself as Sophie. She had worked at the warehouse for a little over a year, picking up shifts around her night classes and her mother's medical appointments. She spoke about it plainly, without self-pity, the way people do when hardship has simply become part of their daily math, rather than something they expect sympathy for. Richard asked, carefully, why she stayed at a job with a supervisor like Doyle. Sophie shrugged. Jobs are hard to find. And besides, my grandfather used to say something, that it's not the easy days that show you who you are. It's the hard ones. Doyle's just one hard day. I've had worse. Your grandfather sounds like a smart man, Richard said quietly. He was, Sophie said. He passed a while back, but he taught me most of what matters. He used to say, the measure of a man isn't how he treats people who can help him. It's how he treats people who can't do a single thing for him in return. Richard felt something shift in his chest, quiet and unplaceable, like a memory trying to surface from underwater. He didn't ask her grandfather's name, not yet. The afternoon shift brought more of the same from Doyle. Sharper words, unfair blame, a general disregard for the people doing the heaviest work in the building. By late afternoon, Richard noticed Sophie stepping outside during a short break, phone pressed to her ear, speaking softly. I know, Mum. I already called about the pharmacy bill. I'll figure it out, I promise. No, don't worry about it. That's my job to worry about, not yours. Grandpa always said we take care of our own. I'm not about to stop now. Richard, standing several feet away, pretending to check his own phone, felt his breath catch. He waited until Sophie ended the call before speaking. Your grandfather, Richard said carefully. What was his name? Sophie looked at him, a little surprised by the question. Walter Grant. Why do you ask? For a moment, Richard couldn't answer. 30 years folded into a single instant. A diner counter, a check for $11,000, a promise made over black coffee by a man who had nothing to gain from keeping it. Don't forget where you came from. Richard hadn't just forgotten. He had built an entire empire without once noticing that the granddaughter of the man who saved his life was standing on his own warehouse floor, sharing her lunch with a stranger, being belittled daily by a supervisor Richard had never bothered to meet. He sounds like he was a good man, Richard finally said, his voice quieter than he intended. He was the best one I ever knew, Sophie said simply, unaware of what those words had just done to the stranger sitting across from her. At the end of the shift, as workers filed toward the time clock, Richard asked to speak with the site manager, not Doyle, but the regional director who oversaw the location, a woman named Patricia, who Richard, as CEO, had met exactly twice in 6 years. He asked her, plainly, to gather the floor staff for 2 minutes before everyone left for the day. Patricia hesitated, unsure why a day laborer was making requests, but something in Richard's tone, quiet, unshakable, made her comply. When the workers gathered, tired and eager to go home, Richard removed the old jacket, stood a little straighter, and spoke. My name isn't Thomas Ellery, he said. It's Richard Hale. A ripple of confusion moved through the small crowd. Doyle's face went pale. I own this company, Richard continued. I worked this floor today because I wanted to see, honestly, how the people at the bottom of my company are treated by the people I put in charge of them. I got my answer. He turned toward Doyle. You will not be supervising anyone at this company by the end of the week. Doyle opened his mouth to protest, but Richard raised a hand, calm but final. I heard everything today, every threat, every insult. That ends now. He turned back to the group, his eyes landing, briefly, on Sophie, who stood frozen near the back, still holding her empty lunch bag. 30 years ago, Richard said, his voice unsteady for the first time all day, a man gave me everything he had saved in his life, because he believed in someone no one else would. He asked for one thing in return, that I never forget where I came from. He paused. I forgot. For a long time, I forgot completely. Today, a young woman on this floor shared half her lunch with a stranger she owed nothing to, because her grandfather taught her that's simply what decent people do. He looked directly at Sophie now. Her grandfather was Walter Grant, the same man who made this company possible in the first place. A stunned silence spread across the loading dock. Sophie stared at Richard, her mouth slightly open, piecing together a coincidence too large to fully comprehend in the moment. "I don't know how to repay a debt like that," Richard said quietly, "but I intend to spend the rest of my time running this company trying." In the weeks that followed, Richard didn't simply return to his top-floor office and issue a memo about workplace culture. He walked the floors, all of them, every location. He learned names, not all 700 at once, but a few more each week, until the number that had once felt abstract began to feel like actual people again. He removed 3 other supervisors whose conduct mirrored Doyle's once formal complaints, were finally investigated honestly instead of quietly buried. He established a direct line for warehouse workers to report concerns without fear of retaliation, reviewed personally, not filtered through layers of management designed to protect the company rather than the people inside it. He offered Sophie a promotion to a logistics coordinator role, a genuine step forward in a career she was quietly building around night classes and family responsibility. She accepted, but not before telling Richard plainly that she didn't want the position simply because of who her grandfather was. "I want it because I earned it," she said, "same as anyone else should." Richard respected that more than he could put into words. He also, quietly and without announcement, ensured her mother's outstanding medical bills were paid in full, not as charity, he insisted, but as 30 years of interest on a debt that had gone unpaid for far too long. Late one evening, months later, Richard stood on the same loading dock where he had once redone a stack of boxes under Doyle's unfair scrutiny. The building was quiet. Most of the shift had gone home. He thought about the $11,000 Walter Grant had given him at a diner counter 30 years earlier. Money Grant could not really afford to lose, given freely to a stranger who had nothing to offer in return, except a promise. He thought about how easily that promise had faded once success arrived, how comfort has a quiet way of making people forget the very things that got them there. And he thought about Sophie, sharing half a sandwich with a man she believed to be a stranger with nothing, simply because it was the decent thing to do. Richard finally understood what Walter Grant had actually been trying to teach him all those years ago over black coffee. It was never about the $11,000. It was about remembering that every person on a payroll, a loading dock, or a bench outside a warehouse is carrying a story just as heavy as your own, and that the true measure of any man isn't what he builds. It's how he treats the people who could never repay him for it. Somewhere, in every company, in every building, on every floor, there are people the world has quietly decided not to notice. The ones doing the heaviest work for the smallest recognition. We rarely know their full stories. We rarely know what they're carrying home with them at the end of a long, thankless shift. Richard Hale spent 30 years building an empire, and it took one single day standing among the people at the bottom of it to remember what his success was actually built on. Not talent alone, not timing alone. One man's decision, a long time ago, to believe in someone who had nothing, and to ask for nothing in return except decency. That is the debt none of us should ever forget we owe, because every encounter has a story, and some change lives forever.